Hello, I'm Andrew Susskind, and I'm a psychotherapist and author based on the west side of Los Angeles since 1992, specializing in trauma and addictive compulsive behaviors. Welcome to my podcast, named after my recent book and workbook, It's Not About the Sex. Here we have direct and honest conversations related to compulsive sexual behavior and trauma, all from a sexual health perspective. Our intention is to offer fresh viewpoints and practical strategies toward establishing greater intimacy and a more deeply connected life. Let's begin. Katie Griffin runs groups and acts as consultant to other practitioners. She is passionate about group as an efficient, cost-effective modality to help people become fully alive. Combining a former business background with psychological theory, she also works with executives in different fields. Today, I am absolutely thrilled to have a wonderful colleague, friend, and really my group therapy mentor with us, Katie Griffin. And I just want to welcome you to today's episode.
Thanks so much for asking me, Andrew. I know it's been a long time coming.
It has been. And why don't we just jump right in with that? I mean, we've been talking about you coming on the podcast for quite a while. What took you so long? What happened?
So I think what I would say about that is I am a private person in general about the details of my life. And I think that got compounded with the idea of not revealing too much that clients that I work with could hear that would interfere with their work with me. So I think it's been double layers, if you like, of my sense of privacy anyway, and then also being careful to guard my clients' work with me, that the focus is on them and not on my work.
So we're similar in that way.
We are, but then you went bold.
This is true.
You went bold and were an inspiration. So that's partly what's helped me get to this conversation today.
Excellent. And so I take it that possibly you will be sharing a little bit more than you're used to, a little bit outside your comfort zone, which is fantastic.
That's true. It's another layer of coming out, shall we say.
I love that. I love that. So that's really a springboard for asking the question, what about your particular history informs how you think about or work with this particular topic?
Right. My experience of individual therapy when I first started it was that essentially my feelings were so unbearable in the one-to-one relationship. I just could not navigate it due to the specifics of the trauma that I suffered in childhood. That replicated too much for me, the trauma, and my shame and anxiety was so high that I could not negotiate individual therapy. So I didn't last very long the first time around.
Sure.
What I found out from that, though, is that once I was offered group as an adjunct to the individual work, there was an immediate relief for me. That idea that there were other people in the room. There were other people who weren't necessarily in the room for my individual therapy, but whom I could tell about it after the fact. Mm-hmm. That reduced the shame for me. It reduced the need to be hypervigilant about the therapist. And then I was able to sink in both in the group and much more in individual therapy.
So can you say a little bit more about how that worked? Because what I'm hearing is that you weren't alone. That once you were in the group therapy setting, there's something about belonging or at least commonality. I mean, how would you describe that?
Belonging and commonality, but more than that, I think since my trauma was one-to-one, one person to one person, idea that there were others who were seeing this person who was in a power position in a very particular way. I think we sometimes can underplay how much that power dynamic operates in the therapy room. And for me, the concept that this person was in my head, wanted to know things about me very intimately, without there being other people to witness that, really did intensify my feelings of anxiety and shame. With group members there, though, that changed. That completely changed. Suddenly I had siblings who knew what was happening. Suddenly I had siblings who could call it out if they saw something that I had not been hypervigilant about. It really changed the experience for me.
I don't know if our listeners are grasping the magnitude of what you're sharing, so I'm just going to say what I'm hearing. The experience in individual therapy was not the timing or the effectiveness or the one-on-one experience of having somebody ask really, really personal questions just didn't sit right for you.
Right.
I don't know if it felt intrusive or it felt
definitely intrusive.
too much.
That's the word. You hit it right there. It's intruded upon. It's, what are you going to do with this information?
Right.
Have I said too much? And then another layer of it was going to disappoint you. I'm not saying the right thing. I've got to manage your experience of me, and all of that as a client. I'm very aware of that as a therapist when I'm working with clients because of my own experience in that way.
And then I heard you say that being in group, it was like being among siblings, and how incredibly valuable that was for you with your particular history, especially, and how it felt safer actually or safe enough maybe to be in that group experience rather than the one-on-one.
Yeah, you use my favorite phrase, right? Safe enough. You've heard me use safe-ish, safe enough a lot. It just needed to be safe enough for me to start to say a bit more about my experience, to say a little bit more about who I was. The sibling experience allowed me people who were either had the potential to protect me, or I could move in and protect, and that felt much better to me. Much calmer. My central nervous system could settle.
Right.
Shame wasn't front and center so much that I couldn't talk. It really changed everything.
I love that, and I'm so glad you're sharing that piece, because I think it's something that not many people actually understand, and how the timing and the setting and whatever those ingredients were for you were just right.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, sometimes I hear people say, oh, how much they can't wait for their individual therapy appointment. They just can't wait because they're going to talk. And I will say that despite the benefits that I've had from doing both for a long time now, I still don't look forward to it in the same way that I look forward to group. And I think that some of these things, while healed a lot, are much harder to completely eradicate. There's just a sense of, this is a little bit trickier, this one-to-one stuff. It's a little trickier for me still.
Right.
Yeah.
Which brings us to our next question, because I know how the depth of your belief in group therapy is tremendous. And your idea is that different work is possible, different therapeutic work is possible in group once anxiety is reduced and once shame is metabolized. Can you expand on that? Because that's another whopper of I think something for our listeners to metabolize and digest.
Absolutely. So if I, again, referring to my own experience and now having worked with lots of people over the years, if the trauma, if the shame associated with trauma, if the anxiety of being with person or people in a space is not reduced enough, then the only thing available to be worked on in that environment, whether it's individual or group, is reducing the trauma and reducing the shame. A shame experience, in my unhumble opinion, is a self-referential experience. Relationship in that moment is very difficult. So if you're involved with yourself and you're involved with your shame, then where is the possibility for you to enter into a relationship in that moment? We have to reduce that enough to make the connection that I think is incredibly important. The connection is the healing piece.
And if I'm hearing you correctly, it's like a wall of shame or a wall of anxiety that really has to be worked through in order for the connection and relational experience to really take shape.
Perfect. So if we think about it as a wall, slowly that wall has to lower enough. And sometimes it's lowering and peering over the edge, and sometimes it's taking a brick out, peering and putting the brick back in again.
Mm-hmm.
Pacing, I think, is incredibly important for people in that space. People should be allowed to raise the wall back up. They should be allowed to put the brick back and use those defenses until they feel ready to lower them for longer periods of time, and longer periods of connection are available.
Mm-hmm. So again, if I'm saying this correctly, it sounds like it's ultimately about building capacity for connection, building capacity for intimacy, but sometimes it can be super slow, right? It's not always
Super slow.
yeah.
Super slow. Yes, and appropriately so, based on
Mhm.
someone's circumstances. It was appropriately slow for me. The pacing was super important. But you're also mentioning the tolerance, the growing the emotional bandwidth, frankly, to tolerate shame in the presence of others also. Shame's not going away. We're still going to have that experience. But realizing that it's not the death of me, realizing it's not the death of the person next to me, if we have that experience together and talk about how it feels together, the body experience of it, the emotional experience of it, all of those things, then that tolerance builds, the emotional bandwidth builds, the ability to stay connected while having what were previously unbearable feelings.
Right.
Very healing experience eventually.
Sure. And I tend to quote Brene Brown a lot. She talks about shame resilience, which I love because it's not about getting rid of it, right? It's really about learning to live with it and understanding internally what that's like to be able to have it, share it, be seen with it, and to move on and know that you can hopefully find meaningful connection through it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It could be a bridge. I mean, I think we have the idea that if we're going to experience shame with others, it's just going to be the most mortifying experience. Actually, it's often a bridge. I see it as a bridge in groups so often, where somebody will say the thing that they think is the worst thing ever. They'll have the shame experience, and someone moves toward them and says, "Ugh, me too." How relieving. There's the bridge. There's the bridge back into relationship.
Mm-hmm. And in addiction or compulsive behaviors, one thing we know is that shame is going to show up no matter what, in big ways.
In big ways.
And so it's really in each group member, right? We can assume that there's shame in the room universally, but it just shows up differently at different times. But to hold, I guess what I'm hearing you say is to hold that intention as group leader and to normalize it for the group members.
Yes. Yep. I think you're right that it's a hallmark. Shame's a hallmark of addiction and other types of compulsive behaviors. It's a hallmark of those, but it's a hallmark of being a human being in the world too.
Yeah.
I don't think you have to identify as someone who's got problematic behaviors or is in recovery necessarily from an addiction to understand the incredible experience of shame as a human being.
Right. And someone once told me that if we think that there aren't addictive compulsive behaviors in each and every one of us, we're missing the boat, that there's always.
I 100% agree. Yes.
Exactly. Right.
We're doing something. We're doing something.
For sure. So along those lines, how do you think about the role of addiction or compulsion in all of this?
Yeah. So reading your book and your workbook and knowing you as I do, I know that you think of connection as the antidote to addictive processes, addictive behaviors, compulsive behaviors, those types of things. I completely agree with that. I think we hear about it in the 12-step community where there's a sense of joining and connection. I think in process group or in therapy group, the option to go deeper than that is possible. And the reason I think that's important, the healing connection happens in individual therapy with an individual therapist, yes. When you have a group that consists of a variety of different people, different personalities, different responses to you, then the types of connection you can make that are the antidote to you moving back into problematic or deadly addictive behaviors.
Right.
That's the antidote right there. So the more that as a group leader, I can help people make multiple connections in the group beyond me. I'm just at that point, I'm the vehicle for the connection. That I think is super important for people, putting aside compulsive behaviors, putting aside problematic addictions.
And I want to add that we're not just talking about warm, fuzzy connections, that sometimes it's connection based on anger, or a connection based on shame or envy, or all kinds of different feelings, hurt.
Fear, terror, yes.
Right. So I just want to clarify that, because I think that what you're saying is so valuable, and it's not just about being liked or having to, accept everything that everybody says in group.
No, the exact opposite, I think. Being liked might be a starting point, and sometimes it's not even a great starting point. I think there is authentic connection involves every human emotion. Authentic relationships that truly develop in an intimate way involve every feeling over time. The idea that we're going to be in a group of others, in my practice, that's usually 7 or 8 others. The idea that we're going to be in a group with that number of people and be liked by everybody, that there'll never be any anger, I would say that group is dead if that's going on. Right. I would say we really need to explore what's happening here. Who's not saying something? Who's probably everybody if we're not having all of the feels. So that's what I'm looking for, is authentic expression for people of all their feelings.
The term that I've heard you use before is progressive emotional communication. And I love that. And I think that is really the hallmark of a group that's really on a growing edge.
Yes, I'd love to be able to credit where that there are multiple people who use that. It comes out of modern analysis, I believe. But I'd also like to be able to credit, and cannot because I can't remember who said this a long time ago. But there's some idea that if 2 people sat and faced each other, and if we put it in a group context, if we have 8 people plus me in a group, sat in silence, said not a word, and sat there and looked at each other, made eye contact, turned, made eye contact with someone else, that over the course of a time period, who knows how long it would take, 15, 20 minutes, all of human feelings would be available in the silence. And I think if we can make that out loud, if we can do that out loud, then that is progressive emotional communication. You and I can talk back and forth about our feelings, seeing how we impact each other. That's progressive, and it deepens intimacy, deepens connection.
Sure. So if we move the conversation to sexual identity development, what is the impact of trauma and addiction on this really fundamental part of being human?
Yeah. So the way that I think about it is that trauma and addiction can prevent or slow down aspects of identity development in general. So if we took a topic like your identity as a career human or a working person, you can watch people be able to not work at all, so underwork, not be able to hold a job. That I think is associated with trauma responses in a work setting. It can often be a result of addictive behaviors that impact ability to attend work, for example. You can see people take work to the other extreme, which becomes in and of itself an addictive response to perhaps an underlying trauma. I'll give you an example. I don't feel good enough in the world in terms of my relationships, but I can work like crazy and I'm really good at it. And then I can show that to the world as my primary identity.
Sure.
I do think that that's a result of having difficulty with balance because of the impacts of trauma and addiction. That's what I'm talking, that's what I think for that. if we think about it in terms of sexual identity development, the level to which that very tender aspect of being a human can be impacted by trauma and addiction, sort of double down on it, triple down if your developing sense of sexual identity is non-societally approved. Anything I've always identified as queer. You put queer on the top of an identity development, sexual identity development. You put trauma on top of that. You put addiction on the top of that, and you're gonna have to fight very hard to find who you are as a human, who you are as a developing individual.
Right. And I think the common description nowadays is marginalized communities.
Sure.
And you're talking about multiple marginalized.
Multiple and intersecting. Yes.
Yeah. Separate question that came up for me as you've been talking. Do you feel that each and every client that comes to group has some type of trauma somewhere in their background?
I know it's popular to use the trauma word, and how many times have I said it already so far? I know it's popular. I want to think about it in terms of big T and little t, very old expressions for looking at trauma. But I think we also understand trauma so much more than we used to. And I'm using it in a general way to mean non-optimal experience of being brought up. Not sure if anybody has an optimal one. Some people have more optimal than others.
Right.
And optimal for an individual may mean, for example, you may know this, I certainly know this, that there was more than me growing up in my household. And for me, it wasn't optimal because of my particular way of being in the world and my experience of me. For another sibling, it was considered extremely optimal. So it's not very cut and dried. Do I think of everybody as having a trauma of some kind? When we put it in the context of non-optimal, yes, I think people aren't attracted to doing this work if they've had a more optimal experience growing up.
Right. Pia Melody from the Meadows used to say, anything less than nurturing is an indication of trauma. Any kind of holes, any kind of gaps. And I thought that was a really clear and simple way of considering it.
That's a great measure.
Yeah. So how does group therapy help in sexual identity development?
So I think that everything we've been talking about leads to folks arriving in group often with no solid or stable sense of themselves in a general way, but specifically in their sexual identity, especially if they don't identify as heterosexual. And I don't necessarily mean fixed, by the way. I'm not a believer in arriving at a sexual identity and that's it forever. I'm completely the opposite. I think there's a lot of fluidity in the way people experience themselves, that time, living, relationships impact all of how people develop their own sense of sexual identity. But in a more stable childhood environment, I think folks can work through, play with, and experience with less fear and shame, not no fear and shame, but less fear and shame and much more freedom and joy. What Jack Morin calls in his book, The Erotic Mind, the 4 cornerstones of eroticism. I've edited in my own work, he calls them something slightly different, but I think of them as longing, challenging proscriptions, working with power, and testing ambivalence. And if you and I had an hour to talk here, we could go through each of those. But I think the title of each gives a flavor for what it is that somebody needs to do for themselves to start to understand their sexual identity, how they experience themselves as a sexual being.
So part of what I'm hearing, and I want to really check this out with you, is that you hold the space for each and every person who comes to your groups to explore, possibly examine more deeply what their sexual identity development is about. Is that accurate?
Absolutely accurate.
Yeah. So say more about how you arrived at this point, because I don't think every group therapist comes from that vantage point.
I think fundamentally for me, the ability to express oneself sexually in a way that is congruent with who you are, with an enjoyable sense in the world, with freedom about how you move around in the world, is a fundamental part of being a human. There are lots of things that therapy does. There are lots of things that group does to allow people to develop a stable sense of themselves in other ways. But this one often gets missed. And I think it gets missed when we focus on the top level of trauma and addiction. We don't look at what did that get in the way of for folks. We don't look at whether or not there's freedom in the way people move around in the world. We're focused on the symptoms. We're not focused on the underlying desire for people to be fully alive, fully in their libido in all senses of the word. So, you've heard me say multiple times that I think libido in the broadest sense is what we're helping people have when they can have an authentic experience of themselves in group. Specifically around sexual identity, I want to make a space once we've done those, removing the trauma and the huge amount of anxiety and the hypervigilance out of the way, I want to make a space in group for people to do the things that they didn't or weren't able to do in their childhood around sexual identity, play with it, express their feelings, deal with the disappointment and fear when their longing doesn't match somebody else's. Very specifically for members identified as not straight, to keep unpacking the societal baggage that's been loaded on top, which I call queer shame. We get loaded up as people who identify as non-straight. We get loaded up with society's fear, shame about their own sexuality. It's very easy to put it onto marginalized identities and not for the rest, and for the rest of the folks not to deal with that. So making a space in group for us to remove that so people can enjoy themselves in a full extent. I think group has a possibility of doing all of that.
And I just wanted to highlight the idea of how sex is one of those taboo subjects, whether it be in families, couples, groups. It doesn't always get brought out. And I hear that not only do you hold the space, but you invite the dialogue when it seems to be naturally coming up for someone.
Yes, definitely when it's organic, but I'll also push when it feels to me that it's not being spoken about. I think you know this about me, but if I think there's something under the surface that people are frightened to say or really want to, but not sure if this is the environment to say it, I'll encourage with some pacing, just like we talked about. I don't want to push anybody beyond what their natural limits are. But sometimes our natural limits need a challenge too.
Right.
We need an invitation. We do need an invitation to say it.
And someone can accept it or not, but to open the door and open the door and open the door until someone's ready.
Exactly.
I also want to just say that this is a beautiful sexual health conversation that we're having. And we've talked on the podcast many times about how sexual health is really an expansion on recovery from compulsive sexual behavior, right? And so I just want to put in a plug, because I also am such a group therapy junkie, that group is such a fantastic place to explore these issues in a safe enough way, and from a sexual health perspective, if the group therapist has that perspective and that understanding.
I'm with you 100%. I could not possibly edit one word of what you just said.
You could, but
I'm not going to.
Right, exactly. But I guess I'm so enamored with what you're saying and how it fits so neatly into a sexual health model, right? Because sexual identity development is one dimension of what sexual health is truly all about.
Agreed. I think if I were to expand just a little, I think for me, if we don't come to our work as therapists with a model of sexual health, then what we are promoting is, at best, lack of growth, at best, a societally approved or something way of expressing sex, sexuality, it does not have a lively feel from my perspective. It doesn't have a feel of freedom associated.
Right.
So I think the first space for doing this work in group is for therapists to be looking at their own sense of sex, sexuality, sexual identity development. If it's not being talked about in their practices, asking some tough questions for themselves about what are they shutting down in terms of conversation? What are they not welcoming in terms of conversation? And what are their fears and worries and terrors about the idea of talking about sexual health?
Right. And when that does come up for someone, they can give you a call and get some consultation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. The last question that I always ask on the podcast is the idea of takeaways. So if there were a few takeaways that you would like the listening audience to be able to make portable, what would they be from today's conversation?
In general, I would love people to understand that while there's an idea that doing this sort of work in group could promote more shame in an individual, it's my experience that that is not true. It might be an intense feeling to start with, but that actually the dynamism of group, the play of group, the sense of being with people who get you in a particular way far outweighs the moments in group that you are going, whoa, should I have said that? It far outweighs that. And I would also say for therapists who are terrified of doing group, and there are lots of people out there, it's understandable, not everybody is going to end up being a group leader, but I would want you to consider what are the possibilities for referring your individual clients into some additional group work for you and for the client, or for you to be in a group and see what you develop, see what happens for you. It's fun.
It is fun. And I don't think the average person realizes how much fun it really is. It keeps me on my toes as a group leader. It keeps me on my toes as a member of a group. And I could not agree more. So, Katie, I feel like we could talk all afternoon about this, and yet we need to wind down our time together. And I just want to thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your expertise and your excitement and yourself, because I know that's something that's not always easy for you. So I'm just really, really thrilled that you could be a part of our podcast today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's always a pleasure spending time with you. So any excuse.
Take good care. Thanks for listening today. It was so terrific sharing the time with my close colleague and close friend, Katie Griffin, and discussing this really meaningful topic. She can be reached through her website at katiegriffinconsulting.com. If you're so inclined, please give us a 5-star rating and be sure to subscribe and share my podcast with those who may benefit. I look forward to you joining us the next time, and don't forget to stay connected.